Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the need for a collaborative lunar architecture. My name is Jack Coor, and I'm the research director at Payload. I think this is going to be a really fascinating and fun webinar today. We talk a lot about setting up a permanent base on the moon, but today we are going to discuss our plans for actually setting up the infrastructure needed to support life and to support an economy and to support a lunar base in the future. It's really going to be talking about the building blocks of this lunar base and of a permanent presence on the moon. So we'll talk about in situ resource utilization, mobility. We'll talk about habitats, everything under the sun. We have a really awesome team of panelists today that I want to welcome everyone to it. And I think what would be helpful maybe is if we do a brief kind of 30-minute intro on everyone. And maybe, Bob, I can start with you first if you want to just kind of introduce yourself and the organization you're with.
Yeah, sure. Good day to everyone. My name is Bob Lombaré from the Luxembourg Space Agency, Senior Manager for Exploration and Space Resources. Maybe so Luxembourg Space Agency is not a traditional space agency in a sense. We do not have our own missions, but we work closely with industry to develop space technology and services with a commercial long-term use case or objective. And then I think of relevance for this panel, in 2017, we launched the Space Resource Initiative in Luxembourg, which under which we conduct different activities, and basically we try to set up an international framework where commercial companies can use space resources. We conduct research, public research in Luxembourg in that field to understand how to process, extract, and use the resources. We work closely with industry to develop the technology to use those resources. And we also put a lot of effort in identifying the first commercial use cases of space resources. And in this panel for lunar exploration, lunar resources, we believe play an important role actually to stay on the lunar surface in the long term. They play an essential role, maybe not in the first years, but afterwards they have definitely a key role to play.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Bob. Mark, I'll pass it on to you for your intro.
All right, thanks, Jack, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Karasich, and I spent the first 40 years of my career with NASA. I started in operations, and the latter half of my career, I was in lunar programs, building hardware. That included the Orion program, and for the last 3 years of my career, I'm the Artemis campaign manager. So a lot of the things we're talking about today on the industry side and on the international side were things I worried about every day at NASA. In May of this year, I joined the Exploration Company, which is a 3-year-old European company. I'm U.S. employee number 1 of 1, and our company is an in-space transportation company. We're going to make in-space transportation vehicles, and we were awarded our first contract from the European Space Agency of May of this year to build Nix Earth, which will take cargo to and from the space station, return cargo back to the Earth. And we hope our plans are to extend that to the moon, both the gateway as well as the surface of the moon. And thanks for involving me, Jack.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks a lot. And Laurie, I can toss it to you.
Sure, and thanks also to Jack for inviting me to the webinar today. I'm Laurie Chappell. I'm the Senior Director of New Business at MDA Space, the robotics group of MDA Space. So probably what we're best known for is the Canadarm and Canadarm2 robotic systems on the space station. With respect to the moon, we're now very focused on delivering Canadarm3 for the Lunar Gateway. So that's Canada's first contribution to the Artemis architecture is an AI-enabled robotic system that is going to do a lot of the things that the existing Canadarm systems do on the space station, but then extended in a more advanced way to support the lunar architecture. Then, as part of that, we're spinning off a commercial product line from that Canadarm3 investment called the MDA Skymaker, which is to create commercial robotics and mobility products that can be used for all the commercial activity that's going to take place at the gateway and then on the surface of the moon. For example, robotics for lunar rovers or even lunar rovers themselves. So that's what we're up to.
And Rob?
Hey, good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where everybody is. My name is Rob Chambers. I'm at Lockheed Martin. My official title is the Director of Strategy for Exploration, which is kind of boring sounding, but my informal title is Director of Hopes and Dreams here for Lockheed when it comes to the moon and beyond. I worked I guess for Mark when he was the NASA customer on Orion for, I don't know, about 87 years, I think, Mark, and have interacted with a lot of the folks on the call over the years. So we're super interested, of course, on the Lockheed Martin side. We build Orion, which is going to get us out, get the humans transported out there, but there is so much more to be done at and around and on the moon that now we're kind of turning our thoughts and energies and focus onto what that future might look like. So thanks for having us all on today, Jack.
Awesome. Great. And for the audience, there's a chat box or a question Q&A box. Feel free to plop questions in and we'll try to get to them. It'll be just an open conversation. Thank you all for the introductions. I want to start off by framing the Artemis program because we're not going to talk too much about the first couple missions. I think we're going to try to focus on, after we start a consistent flow of transportation to the moon. But I'll just very briefly frame it. We have the Artemis program is going back to the moon, not to visit, but to stay there. Laurie and MDA is helping, as you mentioned, outfit Gateway with, we'll have Gateway, which will be the lunar orbiting station. And there'll be a robotic arm on there from MDA. Lockheed is obviously supplying Orion, which will be instrumental in bringing us to the moon. There's a lot of debate and conversation on when Starship and Blue Moon will be ready for Artemis 3. Right now, I think it's net September 2026, which is probably a little too soon, and we'll probably look in a couple years after that. But regardless, we are looking in the next, 5 years for us to go back to the moon in a big way with dozens of tons of payload to the lunar surface, which is going to just change the paradigm of what we can actually do there. And the idea is in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we can really start thinking and enacting on having folks live and work and be on the moon. And that is what our discussion here is going to be today. So the title of this webinar is on common lunar architecture. Mark, I want to ask you first. I know the exploration company has a contract for a lunar lander, and maybe I'll just have this be the broad kind of Artemis question. What's the importance of having these three different big landers? You have Starship, which is massive, 100 tons to the surface. You guys are bringing a couple tons, but you've been in this industry for a long time. How does this kind of excite you, and what does this open up for the future of the moon?
Yeah, a couple things, Jack, and thanks very much. And by the way, to date, we have the contract for the LEO cargo delivery, but you're right. We are working on what we call a larger preliminary designs of a larger lander that will deliver 3 to 4 metric tons to the surface of the moon. And you're right. That's in addition to a large landscape of players. First of all, both SpaceX with their Starship and Blue Origin with their landers that will carry people, as well as they have additional cargo capability, and as well as in addition to amongst others, the commercial lunar payload services contractors. And we saw, by the way, some really exciting missions earlier this year with the first time an American spacecraft has landed on the moon from Intuitive Machines in a long time. And each of these, there's niches, like you mentioned. Blue Origin and SpaceX are building large, and SpaceX very large landers. The current generation of CLPS landers are relatively small, and we see a niche. And in fact, NASA has seen a niche in their architectural studies. They've identified gaps, if you will, in landers that can take down between essentially the space to build what the CLPS payloads, CLPS landers can do today, and what the larger landers can do. Because you need that kind of cargo capability to expand the exploration program first, as NASA has proposed it, and their Artemis missions, the longer durations, the more deeper scientific explorations, the further traverses from your landing spots, but then also to enable this lunar economy that we're going to talk about today too, where we first of all deliver raw materials, raw machines to the surface, and then they start producing things. And it's important to be able to bring those things back to either the gateway orbit or back to the surface of the Earth.
Great. Awesome. And so I want to jump right into now, past the first couple Artemis lunar landings, and now we have a consistent flow from the varying landers that Mark mentioned, and we want to now set up a permanent base on the moon. What is the most critical infrastructure that we need to set up first after we have those landers land on the moon? And maybe Rob, I can toss this one to you, on just like the first, in the first couple of years when we have a consistent flow, what's the first infrastructure that we'd look to set up?
Yeah, and by the way, I was going to share a couple of pictures of Mark's lander team, but I think you have to enable sharing for us. So
I did. Okay.
Muck around with that. It's a pretty looking, but we can show the reentry vehicle too, Mark, which will be important for exports, like Bob will probably talk to us about. So, when I was talking to my daughter who just graduated from college, and I said, you get out of school and what you need when you get into a house is electricity, water, cable, and a family car, maybe a nuclear rocket, depending on what kind of a student I guess you were in college. And those are the things that we need at the moon as well. And those are the infrastructure required just to do anything. And so I think the first three really are communications, cable in our little analog. And of course, that's happening now with both Moonlight on the European side and the NSN that Intuitive Machines was just selected for here in the States. We need to, as soon as you get on the surface, you really see how big the moon is. That sounds a little facetious, but the truth is it's enormous relative to our scale of thinking. So you're going to need mobility immediately. And whether that's LTVS type of things, which are crew-centric, or utility vehicles like Canada's looking at, and Laurie could share a little bit of thoughts on that with us. And then power. As soon as you're able to drive around, if you want to do anything overnight or go into places that aren't brightly lit, plus also we're going to be at the South Pole, which is very, very different looking than when you think of the equatorial missions where the sun was kind of overhead from an Apollo, or at least traversed the sky going overhead the Apollo guys had. So those are the three that we're the most initially focused on in terms of getting the right infrastructure in place, because with that then you can grow. And of course all those systems, to put them on the surface, require the ability to land that stuff on the surface.
Yeah. Great. So you mentioned comms, mobility, and power.
Yeah.
Those are kind of the first infrastructures that we look to set up. Laurie, there we go. Rob has, oh, cool.
I wrested control of the screen. So yeah, Mark, that's good as conceptual design for do you have a name for that?
Yes, I can explain. First of all, Rob, thanks for sharing the picture.
Is it named Rob? I just want to check that. Is it named Rob?
we have named the name of our spacecraft is Nyx, and it's after Greek goddess. And we actually have 3 variants. So you have to that right there is the low Earth orbit version of our Nyx spacecraft, and very creatively we call that Nyx Earth, and it will take cargo to the space station, and then in a couple of years the follow-on commercial low Earth orbit space station destinations. And then we have a variant that will go back and forth both ways. Will return cargo from the gateway, and we call that, creatively enough, the Nyx Gateway spacecraft. And we are very excited about this, and we think there's a need for this because not only, we talk about the surface needs, and not only do you need to deliver, there's this gap, if you will, in surface cargo delivery needs. There's also a need to fly cargo back from the gateway. So our Nyx Gateway will provide that spacecraft. And the picture you showed first is the 3rd evolution. This will be our Nyx Lander. Again, we're thinking larger than current commercial lunar payload services, clearly smaller than the biggies from Blue Origin and Starship, but to fill these gaps for that you talked about, deliver the systems that provide the power, the navigation, enable rovers to go farther, and enable the people who are going to live on the surface with the consumables and the clothes and they need, as well as to support the commercial activities that'll be starting. But thanks for that, Rob. Did I hit all 3?
You did. You did great. Yeah.
Hopefully they're easy to follow subnames.
Yeah. Rob, Nyx Rob would still be good. I'll work you offline.
Yeah, I will think about that.
You know what I'm just noticing here is our panelists are true to the name of the webinar. We have the exploration company is European based. Where is it? Where exactly is it? What country is it?
We have there is no single company. We're already in Europe. We have 3 offices. Munich, Germany, Bordeaux, France, and our newest one in Europe is in Turin, Italy. And that was stood up just a few days before, as I mentioned, we opened our office here in the U.S. in May of this year.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, so we have spattered around Europe. We have Luxembourg, we have the U.S., and we have Canada with MDA. So we really have a good group. Maybe Bob, I'll ask you, what's the importance of having the moon being a joint international effort with multiple organizations, multiple companies, and multiple space agencies collaborating here?
I think this international collaboration is very important for the long term. I think in the short term, or like we know from the Apollo times, one country can do it and come back. But if we really want to go beyond a simple picnic, I think we need to have a common infrastructure based on services of exchange of services. And I think it's also this whole lunar exploration has become a quite global endeavor. So beyond now the European side, we also see Korea, we see Japan, we see India, we have the Chinese. So we see a multitude of different players. And I think that the key for the long term lies in learning how to do this together, to exchange services, so that not everyone has to bring comms, not everyone has to bring power, but that you can rely and exchange these services, use infrastructure, have landing pads where you can land in a reliable way, in a precise way, where you can repeat this on and on, where you have affordable transportation, or over the time, as we bring more cargo to the lunar surface, hopefully the price per kilo will go down. Eventually, in the long term, once we start learning how to use local resources, produce local propellant, for example, I think the return capacity and the price to bring something back from the moon to Earth will drop significantly. So I think all of this is really an effort together, and this, to achieve this, I think it's important to do this from the very beginning, to have the right interfaces, to be able to exchange something, to have the right to share the same protocols, to be able to use the same communication infrastructure, have the same reference grids when it comes to navigation, to have also shared transportation. If you don't fill up your lander, you can bring something else. So maybe in the future you will have shared customers on a transportation vehicle, like Mark presented. I think the more we learn how to share and use these services, the more efficient it all becomes together.
Yeah,
we were talking about compatibility, and Bob, I had joked to Laurie at one time that if we have all the wheels be intercompatible, there might be a time when MDA finds that the Canadian rover is up on cement blocks and the Americans snagged a wheel or two just for a week or two because we're having problems. So
That's too compatible.
Yeah. So she's like, okay, well, we're going to do ours in metric and you can do it. We'll avoid that kind of thing. But, when you think about how hard of an environment this is and how different Lunar is from low Earth orbit, being able to rely on each other and rely on being able to transfer hardware and algorithms and whatever else is required, I think is without that, we're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and Laurie, I want to pick up on what Rob said a couple minutes ago on the first three infrastructure projects that he would recommend. And he talked about comms, he talked about power, and the last one was mobility. Would you agree those are the three important ones that you would tackle first? And I know you're working in the robotics mobility part of that, so we'd love to hear the MDA story with regards to that.
Yeah, absolutely, and for sure, like if you're worried about whether you have enough power or you can't communicate, it's very hard to do anything. Rob, if you can put back up the picture of the exploration company lander, I thought it's interesting. Like from if you're a robotics mobility kind of person like I am, I see the picture and I see there's what I think are a couple payloads on top. And I don't see a way to get the payloads off or move them. So it's an example of once you solve the problem of getting this lander to the ground, then the pieces that we're talking about to stitch this all together as the lander shows up, and then there would be some sort of mobility system that would come by and either receive the payloads off the top of this lander or reach up and grasp the payloads to safely move the payloads away from the landing site. Because of the blasts that the lander creates, you're not going to set up your permanent settlement like 2 meters, 2 meters beside the lander, because there's going to be a blast zone. So one of the key pieces of infrastructure that we're looking at is how do you efficiently move cargo, like do logistics from the landers to the permanent settlements in a safe way, but also in a way that doesn't require a lot of human intervention. So we've learned a lot through the space station robotics, where when we started out, it was astronauts on joysticks doing the robotics. We gradually moved to a place where there's very few operations today that the astronauts on the space station are doing. It's being controlled from the ground. It's not autonomous yet. I'd say it's automatic. You can say to the robot, go to this place or do this thing, and the robot goes and does that. Where we're going to with the next generation of robotics is doing things more autonomously. So increasing that level of autonomy, so you could maybe say, go get that payload and lift it off the deck and drive autonomously to the habitat and not need to burden astronauts or have people in astronaut suits doing these tasks that machinery can be doing. So That's what we're focusing on. And it's obviously something that can be developed over time. Like in the early days, you would have vehicles trying to find their way to the new settlement. There may not be a highway yet, but over time, that's going to be a repeated route that the vehicles will follow. You can train them, you can teach them, and they can repeat that route with very little smarts. So it will evolve, but figuring out the logistics supply chain is one thing we're very focused on.
Hey, one thing, if I could add to that, Jack, so a lot of our viewers and participants may be familiar with the big omnibus BAA broad area announcement, I think, Mark, that Mark probably set up back in the day. And so Next Step, it's called, very complex acronym, but essentially it's an annex-based approach to get all sorts of different kinds of activities. So Appendix A is HABs. Appendix H was the Starship's HLS, and we're up to Appendix R. We're about out of letters, so I don't know. I guess we'll declare the moon has been colonized when we get to Z, Mark. But Appendix R just came out, and that's looking for studies on, from a NASA perspective, on that integrated surface logistics activity, which I find to be pretty exciting because we're moving away from just the transportation systems like Orion or Nix, Rob, or the Nix lander, but also now what are we going to do when we get there? So that's pretty exciting, and it's spot on to what you just said, Laurie. What's the final mile look like?
Yeah, and I noticed one thing that's missing in our discussion is habitats, and is that because the assumption is that the landers will be the habitats, at least for the beginning, and that the habitat infrastructure, external infrastructure, will be set up on a later date?
I think I'll go first, and then team can jump in as well. So the first HABs are really the landers themselves, like you said. So kind of Apollo-esque, but just like we said, as soon as you get there and you're there for an extended period, you want to be able to go further than you can walk, and you probably want to get out of your you just get into something different, quite honestly, and be able to perform science that you don't have to haul the hardware back and forth, or whatever factories Bob is going to have us build from a exportation and exploitation standpoint. So the next HAB or the first HAB, I guess I call it that, will be the Italian, it's called the Multi-Purpose HAB, MPH, and that's a relocatable system per what the Italian Space Agency and NASA have worked out. So that just got through its, I'll get the acronyms wrong, but I think Mission Concept Review, MCR, and so it's working its way through the NASA approvals and should show up in the Moon and Mars architecture later this year and early next year. So that's really exciting because now we'll have a destination, a relocatable one that can come to the vicinity of the landers as we start doing these early missions. So that's pretty awesome.
Maybe here in the first phase, there is also the Japanese pressurized rover, which will play an interesting role. It will also allow the astronauts to do some short duration trips. I don't know how far it really can travel and how autonomous it is, independent from the lander. So, but definitely it's a great idea for the first years of lunar exploration.
Lunar cruiser, I think, or moon cruiser.
Yeah. And Mark, during these first, the first 5-10 years of setting up the base, how do you see the dynamic of government versus commercial playing in here? And do you see kind of this, there's a buzzword or phrase of a cislunar economy that has emerged over the last 5 years. How do you see that play out?
Oh, great. Yeah, great question. And I'm going to use this government commercial to go back to, Rob. Yes, when I was in the government, first of all, I can't take credit for the BAA structure. There was some procurement people way smarter than me that came up with that for you're right, these studies that enabled them. I did, however, get to get to learn a lot about it when I was there, and I was really happy to see the Appendix R, like you say. That it's the first big study about how do we get around on the moon. But to the government or commercial, however you want to phrase it, I like to say it's really, especially now, it needs to be the government and commercial. And government, I'm going to say the term industry, because sometimes commercial has taken on a certain connotation about the way to do acquisitions that we can talk about more too. But especially now, both are incredibly important players in this. As much as we'd like there to be a thriving community, a thriving lunar economy today that sustains itself just like any big industry, communication center, it's not quite there yet. So the government has a really important role to to develop this nascent industry, become an anchor tenant, and drive the anchor objectives that enable this. They also, the topic of standards have come up before, and how do we, and eventually industry will get into the standards, but right now we have been really, we almost dependent. Some of the standards that are available today, like the International Docking Standard, has enabled companies like us to build spacecraft. And right now there are multiple different docking systems you can buy for multiple different manufacturers, OEMs, that you can use to go to the International Space Station, and evolved versions of those to go to the Gateway. So the role the governments play in standards and in creating international partnerships, just to build on Bob's, I really think international partnerships are hugely important. And if you look at what the international collaboration did for LEO, and how big the space station is, and how many different countries participate, and how much goes, how long it's lasted, how long it's been on orbit, and the science and the technology that has grown in there. And I believe the international partnerships that we are building using the Artemis campaign are going to do the same thing for Lunar. We're going to see the same sort of scaling, if you will, from the early space station attempts, Skylab to International Space Station. We're going to see the same sort of scaling because the international team brings more capabilities. So then the commercial, to keep this moving, we have to make people want to do it. And how do you do that? Well, we have to bring back things from the moon that people need. And as I've read a paper recently that Rob wrote, we have to encourage people to want to go there more on their own. And by the way, there are companies today right off the bat that are thinking about that. They are building their business cases solely on literally commercial, being able to sell their services on an open marketplace. And industry's role is important too. There's the more traditional roles. There's the new commercial. Commercial also has a connotation acquisition. I think there's places for both too, both traditional and commercial. Commercial has an ability to allow folks to innovate and hopefully produce end results quicker and cheaper than we will more traditional methods. But that takes effort too. It takes effort from all sides. It takes effort from the contractors. It takes effort from the governments.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I want to, in our early, and then we'll move on to the more sophisticated base, but in our early base that we're setting up, to me, there's two things that are big problems that we don't talk enough about. And one will be to Laurie, one will be to Rob. Laurie, you mentioned the rockets landing on the lunar surface and the blast that's created via that. And then Rob, the next question to you would be on cryogenic storage and transporting and storing cryogenic fuels. Both of these two things are going to be crucial just to getting to the surface and creating that consistent transportation. So Laurie, maybe I'll ask you about what's your take on something as big as a Starship landing on the moon and kicking up lunar rocks everywhere and creating a crater.
Right. Well, I guess that eventually we would get to the point of having prepared landing pads, things like that would minimize that kick up, but that requires fairly precise landing capabilities that we'll eventually get to. So in the meantime, before landing is that precise, and we have basically the spaceport built up, it'll probably involve like construction activities like building berms or things that can protect the habitats, can protect the high value assets. So we've looked at things like doing the equivalent of sandbags on Earth, so like filling bags with lunar regolith and making berms, or other companies I know are looking at sintering techniques. So how do you take the regolith, like what you have on hand, and build berms? So it's just like distance, like move the stuff away from the landing site and do what you can with what you have to create barriers for protection. That's my take on it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the ejecta, never try to guess on a recorded webinar, but I'll guess anyway. I think the ejecta predictions at this point are about 3 kilometers per second, kind of laterally, as you come down, regardless of what size vehicle you have. Larger vehicles, in theory, would kick out more, but 3 kilometers per second is about enough to get you up into the altitude. It'll come back down again, right? Newton's laws, but it gets out into the altitude of NRHO. So it's very, very high altitude debris that gets kicked up and then comes back down. So shielding that and ensuring that you're not disrupting your neighbors in orbit or on the ground is it's going to be really important.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we first started doing the robotics for the gateway, no one really thought about lunar dust at the gateway. And then like all these studies came back with the visiting vehicles and what you're talking about, Rob, and it's been a requirement added that the robotics on the gateway needs to be tolerant of dust, which is incredible. But we're all going to mix all together, apparently.
1/6 gravity. It's pretty weakly bound, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And Rob, I don't know if you wanted to take maybe very briefly the cryogenic storage. I mean, is this?
Yeah. We've been thinking a lot about that. If you think about both Blue Origin and SpaceX's solutions for human landing and very large cargos, as Mark said, there's a sweet spot between CLPS and these human class or human scale cargo vehicles, but those really large vehicles, they're all cryogenic propulsion. So both use liquid oxygen, and then SpaceX is going with liquid methane, and we and Blue Origin, as part of their team, are focused on liquid hydrogen as the fuel. And if you think about that, hydrogen is obviously 20 Kelvin in its liquid state. Oxygen is like 70, methane's 90 or something like that. So they're all 100 Kelvin-ish or less. That's really, really cold. Some of those are very, very small molecules, like hydrogen is the smallest. So that puts a lot of complexity or just engineering work that needs to be done on how you store that. In both SpaceX's and Blue Origin's solutions, there's a large amount of refuelings that need to occur in low Earth orbit. So there's some staging there. And then these are long duration missions to get out to wait for Orion, choreograph the whole thing. So we've been spending a lot of time and energy thinking about a couple of things. One, can you get propellant from the moon rather than always from the Earth through the gravity well? And then how would you store it, whether it's on the lunar surface or in lunar orbit? And so there have been some NASA space technology mission directorate studies, tipping points, looking at a variety of cryogenic storage and management activities. So I think that's one of a little bit downstream. You can brute force, right? Let the boil off occur and so forth. So we can get by for a little while with some of that brute force techniques, but we're really quickly going to need to start figuring out how to on the surface and in orbit, maintain those systems, or if we want to extract them from regolith, how do we go about doing that? And all of that's going to drive lots of power, and that's where space nuclear power versus just solar power. You need both right tools for the job, but I think that's where the pull for nuclear power will come as we try to have a more sustainable presence. And once Mark starts delivering enormous systems to the surface that we can start using, or many systems, many right-sized systems to the surface.
And Bob, this is
medium-sized.
Yeah.
Bob, I know you guys are thinking a lot, and Rob, maybe you can also, after this question, you can pull up the sim too that you have. But but Bob, I know you guys are thinking a lot about resource mining or bringing resources into the economy, whether that's on an asteroid or on the moon. Can you talk about a little bit about what your plans are with that and what your thought is on that?
Yes. So I believe, or we believe that the resources play an important role in two phases. So first, it's about making this whole exploration less dependent on supplies from Earth. So I think once we can reproduce liquid oxygen or liquid hydrogen on the lunar surface, that becomes extremely attractive to have an efficient logistic architecture. And then in the long term, I think it's a bit also creating value in the long term, where the resource might play a role, and also bring this long-term value of lunar exploration or business of lunar exploration to keep this sustainable and affordable and viable in the long term. And I think here to extract the resource, obviously you need a lot of power. Currently, you have two main ideas. One is to extract the oxygen from the lunar regolith, which is lunar regolith is basically a metal oxide, and you can extract the oxygen and then produce oxygen, which gives you already a big advantage for logistics. And the other idea is a bit to go for the lunar water in the PSRs, which is also very attractive, as you also get hydrogen from there. But it's definitely also probably more challenging. There are more unknowns for the moment. Also, on the other side, extracting oxygen from the regolith, it's also not easy. It requires a lot of energy to heat the regolith. There are different processes to extract, and that's what we currently look at in Luxembourg, is how to extract oxygen from the regolith with a molten salt process. It's just one of many. None of them is perfect. They all have their challenges and weaknesses, and that's a bit the resource. And then in the long term, I think it's important to find so the oxygen and the hydrogen is more an enabling resource. It helps us to get this whole thing, lunar exploration, started and make it more sustainable, more affordable. But in the long term, I guess we need to find something more.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you were talking about PSRs, permanently shattered regions, which I think last I checked, the assumption is they're down in the 50 Kelvin range, which I think is even colder than Ottawa, Laurie, at least some days.
A little bit.
Yeah. So I don't know, Jack, whether I'm sharing Teams, to which my colleagues here are sharing the sim via Teams. So it's probably a little bit laggy, and in fact, my system is screaming at me that I'm low bandwidth. But,
We can see it.
Good. So we put this, we put this together, and we're hoping to make it where you can download it. But it's in the Unreal. You can drive if you want. Okay. Like I said, it'll be a little bit laggy, but it's fast when you're playing it. It's in the Unreal game engine, But the reason we did this, well, it's fun as heck as well, but to allow us to start visualizing what these systems are going to look like, and just thinking through both the distances, interconnects. You know, once you drive up, you literally start thinking, okay, how do I get this stuff off of Mark's lander, for example? Or when we go to some of the permanently shadowed craters where we're extracting hydrogen conceptually, you know, how are you going to dump it into the hopper? And, you know, quite honestly, what is the power grid going to look like? Is it all fission based? Can we use power beaming? But we've been using this to visualize the system, and also, to Laurie's point, having a virtual environment now that we can start testing autonomy and AI systems, because, you know, we're probably not going to have crew there all the time, at least not initially. And so how will these systems operate in a safe way? And with the sheer amount of computational capabilities that exist now, we can really put together ray tracing, visual, and, you know, LiDAR realistic point clouds then that can allow us to start testing out these integrated systems in a pure virtual world. So we've been having a lot of fun with this little system.
Yeah, so a lot of that looks like it's we've gone through a couple of the power things that have pulled up. We talked about vision and just the general grid.
Yeah, the stuff you see in the background there right now are these power grid nodes. As we envision them, we'll figure out whoever has the right solution for the mousetrap can be brought forward for that. One of the reasons we did that, this isn't, most of this stuff, well, very little of this stuff is Lockheed Martin stuff. We are looking to partner up with folks. We'd love to get a Mark Kirisich Nix Rob lander with the landing pad location, because we want people to visualize what can they do as part of this future state, because it requires, you know, kind of what Bob was saying, this international, and Mark said this, well, all three of you guys being international, it's the will and the skill of everybody on Earth to get off of Earth, as we sometimes say. So where are the different capability sets that are going to be required in order to, you know, to pull this off? And I got yelled at by one of my colleagues because when we talked about habitation, I forgot to mention soft goods, just as a shameless plug for different technologies, metallics and soft goods or inflatables, like what's been on space station. I think both systems are going to be required. You'll see this little blue, literally blue node on top of one of the landers that is metallic. To kind of answer your question early on, I think some of these landers, we're not going to have a one-way trip for the humans, by the way. That's not what that implies. But that we could land some landers, don't even take the stuff off the lander, and that could be a habitation or a science lab in the future. So all different kinds of approaches and solutions to what's really the greatest team sport ever.
Yeah. And then we've talked, now it keeps on coming up, the need to eventually move from solar to nuclear power. Mm-hmm. And then that kind of trickles down into what is possible with extraction or creating lunar pads or just the complexity of this base. And does anyone, this is just for anyone, any panelists, anyone want to talk about just nuclear power on the moon and what that looks like?
Rob, you're muted. There you go.
There you go. I was having the guys drive over to one of the spots. So we're probably the ones most involved in nuclear of the folks on the call. They're you know, the power density associated with nuclear is so capable, to be honest, that it opens up new, especially if you combine with like liquid hydrogen. From a nuclear propulsion perspective, you can get ISPs, you know, double what you could from chemical systems. And then on the surface, the thing that's really valuable, and in fact, I'll hopefully you won't get nauseous here, but as the guys drive, I'll pop this up again. but you'll notice how flat the shadows are, horizontally speaking, because, South Pole. And there's many very shadowed regions, obviously a lot of permanently shadowed regions. And so what that implies, got to click the yes, is the need to provide power in locations that don't have a lot of sunlight all the time. And so there's sort of a cutover point we're finding between when solar arrays and different types of energy storage are actually less mass, because you need really, really big batteries and a lot of solar arrays to charge them up. At some point it tips over and it's cheaper, lower mass, life cycle cost to go with nuclear. And it's up, in the 80% sort of realm. In other words, if you have less than 80% continuous sunlight, then nuclear starts to win out just in terms of the total system solution. So if you think about anything on the equator, you're at best 50-50. And then depending on where you are in the South Pole, it moves you over. So we've got a long way to go as a nation and as a world to solve it, but there are some active studies going on and active contracts right now, Draco, Jetson, fission surface power that NASA's looking at, and a lot of room for international participation in that as we move forward in a way that's like responsible and sustainable as we move forward at the moon.
Awesome, thanks for that. And we have 8 minutes left, so I want to get to some of the questions in the chat. And interestingly enough, most of the questions focus on a very similar topic, and that is around, we talked about the standardization, but around who is governing this whole base. Is it a nation state? How are these goals going to come together? How is there going to be collaboration? Laurie, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but this is a very intense and complex collaboration that's needed. How do you see kind of everything coming together?
Yeah, and I'm going to key off the thread and some of the questions about the interoperability and how are we going to ensure interoperability. And I think that's really hard because we don't even have that on Earth. But if you look at something like the USB standard, it was something like a bunch of companies came together in the beginning and tried to put something out there, and then the government got a little bit involved, and then eventually a good solution floated to the top. So I think it's going to be a mix of companies and government. What we're trying to do right now is we're under contract to provide robotic interfaces for the Gateway. We're providing robotic interfaces for the Lunar Dawn LTV team. I think the discussion has to be about open sourcing things like that, making, if you're going to put out an interface, make it available to everyone. Obviously, there's a need to make sure there's some sort of standardization or that it works, but putting something out there and then trying to come together to a consensus, probably through a mix of companies putting stuff out there, government saying, mandating a little bit, and then I don't think there's an easy solution. Maybe others have that.
Yeah.
I think it's going to wind up being organic. It's kind of like whoever gets there first, right? And whoever starts interacting. And so I think the best solution, there are a number, NASA's got the standards for Gateway. Hopefully no one's going to invent some weird new connector. And if we use wireless, hopefully it's Qi charging as opposed to something else. But I think it's cultivating and reinforcing everyone communicating with each other. And anytime we get to the moon, whether it's Intuitive Machines doing a landing or Astrobotic and talking through, what MDA's got, but ensuring that folks are communicating so that we can start pressure testing what works well and what doesn't work well. And I think you got to get there and be involved, I think is the number one thing. And then it'll probably be kind of organic.
Yeah. Awesome. And we have just a couple minutes left. I know all four of you guys are on LinkedIn. So is that a good place if people want to reach out to you guys if they have follow-up questions or just want to nerd out on this?
Of
Absolutely.
course.
Yep.
That seems like the easiest option nowadays, rather than go through the emails. Now I want to ask the impossible question of what is a realistic time frame for this little rover that you showed moving around a lunar base. Bob, maybe I'll ask you this question, put you on the spot. What's a realistic time frame for us to have what would resemble a base on the moon, maybe like an ISS style level of complexity base on the moon?
Obviously, it's difficult to predict the future. I think you can only have a short guess, but I would say end of the 30s, it's realistic to see some sort of architecture, and by architecture I mean different players working together, having or providing these basic infrastructure elements that Rob mentioned in the beginning, being able to land, have somehow a shared power grid, have a shared communication constellation. I think to see all of those operational in some form during the 30s, and probably by the end of the 30s, it's realistic to have it. It's my best guess.
Yeah.
The official position of the Luxembourg Space Agency.
No, and it obviously depends a bit how this all works together, and maybe just to add one thought on the global governance. I think beyond now the technical governance and how to technically work together, and that's obviously the most concrete way. But I think it's also how these different players, international players, work together, and that's where the Artemis Accords play an important role, and these efforts, I think, should not be underestimated. They create a framework of how to work. They provide a platform how to discuss together, to work together. What are the principles to stick to? And they are not very strict, the Artemis Accords, but I think it's really a nice way to start defining a framework how to govern this lunar exploration in an international context.
Yeah, awesome. And I think we have time for one last question. I want to have this question go to Mark. Mark, you worked at NASA for decades, right? 40 years, something like that. To me, I'm 30, so I'm young, and there seems to be a lot of hope and a lot of like awesome potential for the future. Do you see this time being different from your 40 years at NASA? Do you see like an inflection point here? Or are you more realistic?
Well, I definitely see something. And in fairness, I've only been out of the agency for about a year, but it seems, and I'm in the industry side now, so I see a lot more. But I see terms of number and quantity of companies that are trying to innovate, trying to get in the game, that are raising private capital. It's the first time, if you look at the amount of private capital that's being raised for some of these companies, including ours, by the way. We are in the middle of a Series B fundraising. I knew about such things when I was in the government. I do not think over my career I ever saw the magnitude of the number of new companies being started and the number of companies talking about collaborating. Mm-hmm. So I'm hopeful. We'll have to get a little bit more time to determine for sure, is this an inflection point? But it's certainly a different period than what I worked in when I worked for 40 years on the U.S. and International Civil Space Program.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all I want to thank the audience for coming and joining us for this hour, and thanks to the panelists for also joining and having this conversation. I think it was very fun and awesome. Again, if anybody wants to reach out to the four panelists or me, we're all on LinkedIn. I'm sure everyone will be happy to talk. But this has been great, and thank you all for coming and participating.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jack.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Bye bye.